All right, let's take a look at the second passage and continue talking about sequence here. So here's the second passage. Now watch what happens with time order in this passage. One day in July of 1938, Douglas Corrigan raced his light plane down the runway of an airfield in New York. He had filed a flight plan that said he was heading back to California. A day later, the airplane mechanic and pilot touched down in Ireland. Later, the authorities asked Corrigan why he landed in Ireland instead of California. He answered, "I guess I flew the wrong way." The flight made Corrigan famous, and from then on he was known as Wrong Way Corrigan, actually. All right, so let's take a look. Now look at what happens in this passage. In the first sentence, it says he took off from an airfield in New York. He had filed a flight plan. So actually, in time order, filing the flight plan came first, then taking off from the airfield came second. So in this story, it's not in time order, right? Otherwise, it would say, one day, Douglas Corrigan filed a flight plan that said he was heading to California. The next day, he raced his light plane down the runway of an airfield in New York, right? That would be in strict chronological order. But in the story, it's slightly out of chronological order, right? We start with him racing down the runway, and then we have a slight flashback. Before that, he had filed a flight plan. Okay, so what is the first event in the story? Now, of the events that were given here, the first one is he left New York. The second one is he landed in Ireland. The third thing says he headed to California. He was heading to California. He left New York. He was heading back to California, right? He didn't actually get to California, but that's where he thought he was heading. So actually, the first one is he left New York. The second one, he was heading to California. The third one is he landed in Ireland. Okay? What words tell when Corrigan landed in Ireland? We just have to look at the words in the story. It says, a day later, the airplane mechanic and pilot touched down in Ireland. So the answer is the third one, a day later, right? What word or phrase tells when Corrigan talked to the authorities? It says in the story, later, the authorities asked Corrigan why he landed in Ireland instead of California. So the answer is the third one, later. And what does the phrase "from then on" mean? So if we look at this story, the flight made Corrigan famous, and from then on he was known as Wrong Way. So forevermore, right? From that time until now is the closest answer there. So let's just say a little bit more about sequence in stories. Now, in some stories, there are different narrative structures, different ways that a writer can set up time in a story. So we've seen one of those ways is chronological order. And that would mean, as we've seen, that the events happen in the order that they happened in time. But we can also have a variation of that. Writer might begin in the present and then flash back to the past. And then the story either ends in the past or it comes back around to the present, like in the Titanic movie that I described. When this happens, when we begin in the present and we begin in a time, we end in that same time, and in the middle, we have a story that goes back in time. Sometimes this is called a frame story. A frame story or narrative. A frame narrative. Because these things frame the central story. You have the central story, the main story, and these are like a frame around it. All right? It's very common, especially in more modern writing. As I said, up until the beginning of the 20th century, almost all stories were told in chronological order. But beginning in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, writers began to experiment a little bit with narrative structure. Okay? All right. Typically on the GED or the HiSET, as I said, a question will give you a list of events, and you'll need to put them in order. Now, it's important when we do this on a reading comprehension test that we actually check the story to make sure we're right. It's very easy to get confused in questions like this, because if the story's well written and we just try to remember it, we may remember things in a different order than they actually happened in the story. So when we're answering questions like this on a GED or a HiSET, it's important to physically look back at the story and make sure we're putting the events in the right order. Okay? All right. Thank you.